I do appreciate everyone's presence this evening. I'll invite you to turn to 1 Timothy in your New Testaments, and we'll be taking our lesson tonight from chapter 5. We've been taking our lessons on Sunday night from 1 Timothy and supplementing that with material from 2 Timothy and Titus for the last several weeks, and we'll continue to do that tonight. I should, before I go further, before I forget, meant to say this morning that Sci-Fair, where I was last week, is where the Casimirs attend regularly. Brother Joseph and Bessie Casimir held a meeting for us here not too long ago. And you may remember that, but I was able to visit with them some, ate lunch with them on Sunday. And so that was a great opportunity, and they send everybody their greetings. And so I just want to pass that along to everybody before we go any further. Well, we've been studying from 1 Timothy, and we noted over the last couple of times we were together that these letters have a good bit to say about women. And it may be that there were some issues in the church at Ephesus concerning women and some things they were doing perhaps that were out of order. And so Paul addresses these things. And we talked a little bit about the kind of woman that a Christian should be. And then we took that information and applied it to, or saw some specific applications of it from 1 Timothy chapter 2, where Paul deals with a Christian woman's appearance and the way she ought to dress, and then also her role in the church. Well, in a different sort of way, 1 Timothy chapter 5 deals with women as well. And this passage may have certain issues in the background. We may not know exactly with 100% certainty what issues Paul might be addressing in this passage, but we want to do our best with it. In those passages where we know something about the issues and the problems that a passage addresses, we surely take that into account, and we try to take into account the historical setting that in which a passage is written and concerning which a passage is written. But for the most part, we have to take the passage as it stands, the Bible as it stands, and deal with that and try to understand it as best we are able and make an appropriate application of it. This passage has to do with widows and the church's responsibility to widows among the brethren and sisters at a local congregation. Some widows in Ephesus may have been in really difficult circumstances, in dire straits. If a woman was dependent upon her husband for her support, and she lost her husband and didn't have, say, male children that could help her out especially, or maybe any children that could help her out for one reason or another, well then she would be in a very difficult situation. And so Paul addresses the church's responsibility to that kind of circumstance. I remember when Brother Owens was a member here, Brother Ed Owens, you might remember Brother Owens, of course. Those who were here when he was living would know him, remember him very well. But I can remember him telling about his childhood. He was born, I think, in the 1920s sometime. I think he was about the same age as my dad, maybe a little bit younger. My dad was born in 1923, and so Brother Owens might have been born around that time, maybe a little bit later than that. But he grew up as a child during the Depression, and his father died when he was a child. And so I remember him talking about the difficulty that his mother had. No husband, no grown children, no grown male children that could go out and work. He was just a child himself. In those days, women did not usually go to college, earn a college degree, and equip themselves to go out into the workforce and make a living for themselves and support themselves. And in case something like that happened, if for no other reason, in case something like that were to happen. I don't know that she had any real technical skills or marketable skills that she could rely on and go out into the marketplace and put herself in a position where she could support herself and her young little child. She was kind of dependent upon the help of others. And so I remember him saying, there were many times I would lie awake in my bed at night and I could hear my mother in the other room crying, because she just didn't know what was going to happen. He said sometimes we might have some potatoes and our neighbor might have some beans, and so we would put that together. We'd put potatoes together and beans, and that would be our supper. And sometimes he said that neighbors would bring laundry. to her home for her to do, and so she could earn some money that way. And you know what the neighbors are doing? They can do their own laundry, but they're just giving her an opportunity in a sort of an honorable, dignified way to work and earn some money for herself and her family. Well, if that was the situation in the first half of the 20th century in the United States, what was it like in first century Ephesus? For a woman to be without a husband and maybe to be without sons or grown daughters who could help her support herself. And so the church had a certain responsibility in those circumstances. We can see from very early on in the history of the church, it was concerned about taking care of widows in the number of the church, among the Christians in the church. And so Acts chapter 1 is a good example of that, beginning in verse 1. At this time, while the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint arose on the part of the Hellenistic Jews against the native Hebrews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. So the 12 summoned the congregation of the disciples and said, "It is not desirable for us to neglect the word of God in order to serve tables. Therefore, brethren, select among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we may put in charge of this task, and we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word." And so here very early on, Acts chapter 6, very early on, there's this issue about the needs of widows in the church. And so the apostles make arrangements to see that those widows have their physical needs provided for. And so now in 1 Timothy, about 30 years later, not in Jerusalem, in Ephesus, it's a long way away from Jerusalem, the similar situation exists, and we find the church doing the same kind of thing. And so all I want to do is just analyze the passage, go through the passage and offer some analysis, and we'll make some observations. This will give us an opportunity to talk about the church's role in doing this kind of work, relieving the needs of people. It'll give us an opportunity to talk about that broader issue as well. And so Paul addresses eventually the responsibility of the church toward these needy widows, but first he emphasizes the responsibility of the family toward their own. And so in verse 3 he says, "Honor widows who are widows indeed." Now take him to me, in that particular case, provide for their physical needs. Honor them by providing for their physical needs. And so either financially or in some way, maybe taking them food or providing some shelter and things like that. But honor widows who are widows indeed. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. And so, children are responsible for the parents. That's first. And so, the first obligation, first responsibility before the church gets involved, Paul says, is for a widow's family to provide for her children or her grandchildren. The law required, the 5th commandment and the 10 commandments, that children honor their parents. Honor your father and mother is what the law says. And do you remember in Matthew chapter 15 how Jesus uses that particular commandment as he rebuts the traditions of the Pharisees? You know, the law says honor your father and mother, but you get around that because of your tradition. Jesus implies in that passage that honoring father and mother would involve not just honoring them in word and addressing them in a respectful way, but showing them honor by providing for their needs. As they grow older, as they become unable to work and support themselves, well then the responsibility falls upon the children, and then 1 Timothy chapter 5 tells us the grandchildren to provide for the needs of their parents. And so the idea is that children are to make some return to their parents. That's the way the New American Standard Bible reads in verse 4. They're to make some return. We understand what he's saying. There was a time when the child could not take care of himself or herself. And so he needed his diaper changed. He couldn't feed himself, couldn't do any of those things. And so what did the parent do? The parent did that for him. Fed him, gave him clothing, gave him a place to live, some shelter, some protection, all of those things. When he was sick, the parents tried to to do whatever it is that was necessary to make him well, all of those kinds of things. And now it's time for the children to return that. And so parent gets older, maybe unable to do a lot of things, maybe unable to even to dress themselves or feed themselves, or so now it's the children's turn, it's the child's turn to do those things for his parents or her parents. The principle then taught in Scripture is family first. Family first. All right? Now the church may get involved, but the principle is family first. All right, so if we have parents that are getting older and we have the ability to take care of them, before we go to the church, well, that's my responsibility to take care of my own parents. All right, so that's the principles that's laid down here in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verses 3 and 4. And then look at verse 8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's a strong condemnation, isn't it? That's strong language. And so if you have a child and he's unwilling to care for his own, well, the consequence is that he's denied the faith. And so again, that's a very strong condemnation. It's a serious charge. So as we children, as we see our parents grow older, need to be thinking in these terms. How can I take care of my family, my parents, as they might need me? But if there was no family to help the needy widow, well, the church might help her. But as we read through this, what we realize is that not all widows were eligible for the church's help. She, in order to receive permanent help or ongoing assistance, well, she would have to meet certain we might say, qualifications. She might have to qualify in certain ways. And so look at verse 5. Now she who is a widow indeed, and that's how these widows are described in the passage, a widow indeed, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God, and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day, but she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. Verse 9, a widow is to be put on the list. I take that to mean she's eligible for permanent assistance, for ongoing assistance, in a situation similar to the one that we found in Acts chapter 6. A widow is put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works. It sounds a lot like the qualifications for elders in some ways, doesn't it? And so here's the kind of woman who's eligible for permanent assistance from the church, at least as far as widows are concerned. If she's shown hospitality to strangers, if she's washed the saints' feet, if she's assisted those in distress, if she has devoted herself to every good work. And so Paul describes the kind of widow. She's left alone. She doesn't have children or grandchildren. She doesn't have family that can take care of her. And so this kind of widow, the church then, if they have the resources to do it, of course, the church then may help her, should help her. Actually, I think we could say, should help her. Well, it goes on to say that younger widows are not to be put on the list at all, but refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires and disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation, because they've set aside their previous pledge. At the same time, they also learn to be idle. So there's a younger widow, and she's given sort of permanent, continual, ongoing assistance from the church. Well, she learns to be idle. As they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things that are not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to marry, to get married, to bear children, manage the household, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach. For some have already turned aside to follow Satan. So younger widows, he said, they're not to be put on the list at all. Now I can hear that. Can't you hear what some of those might go away saying? They come to the elders. Remember the church at Ephesus had elders in Acts chapter 20. Younger widow comes to the elders and says, hey, I need some help. I want to get put on the list. They said, no, I mean, you're not 60 years old. You don't meet this description in other ways. And she goes away. Those mean old elders at Ephesus, they just wouldn't help me. But Paul says, don't put the younger widows on the list. And so that might involve them turning some of these people away. But those were Paul's instructions. So in summary, the church had a plan to take care of widows in need, or widows indeed, as this passage describes them. Only certain widows qualified. Remember, family first. And younger widows were not eligible to be taken care of in this way or put on the list. This local church, the church at Oak Mountain, would do our best to fulfill our responsibilities in this kind of situation if it were to arise today. Our situation is a little bit different today in most cases because we have Social Security, and sometimes widows, they're able to receive some of their husbands' retirement benefits and things like that. And so in those circumstances, it may not be exactly the same as it was back then. But if we were faced with a similar situation, which could very well happen, we would do our best to fulfill our responsibility. If she were a Christian, if she's in need and cannot support herself, or doesn't have sufficient income or resources to support herself, if she has no family to support her, or she has family who's unwilling to support her, could be faced with a situation like that, she could be given continual support if she was the kind of person described in this passage. So, that could occur today, and if it did, well, we do our best to fulfill this passage as Paul instructs us. Well, let me just make some observations then about the teaching of Scripture concerning the church's role in relieving the needs of people, just in general, not widows specifically, but just in general. If you look at verse 16, Paul says, if any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. Now, he's already described what a widow indeed is earlier in the chapter. And so here's a Christian woman, a woman who is a believer, and she has a widow, maybe her own mother, or maybe say a mother-in-law or grandmother, something like that. And so she has a widow. Well, she is to take care of those, and not the church. All right? So let the woman who has a widow take care of the widow, and let the church not be burdened in this particular kind of situation, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. Remember, widows indeed were those who were left alone. All right, that's one of the descriptions of a widow indeed, left alone. And so, the first thing I want to note is that Paul makes a distinction between what the church is to do in this work and what individual Christians are to do. So here you have a situation where an individual Christian has a responsibility that she is to fulfill so that the church can turn its attention to other cases. And so there's an individual Christian who's to act, and the church is to do something else. Now, this principle became a point of controversy among churches in the middle 20th century. And if you've been around for that long, you remember. Can the church do what individual Christians can do? And so that became a real point of controversy in the churches. Well, I think there is a sense in which Christians doing good work, when Christians are out there doing good work, that is the church at work. We might say that distributively. So as we distribute ourselves out in the world and we're doing good work, and in a sense that is the church doing these good works. But here Paul has in mind what the church does collectively. And so here's an individual Christian acting to take care of the widows for whom she's responsible. And he says the church then can turn its attention to other cases. And so the church collectively, as working as a unit, perhaps through its pooled resources, for example. And so in this particular case, a church might take money from its treasury through its pooled resources under the sort of the oversight of the elders and turn to other situations, others who are in need. And so that's the kind of thing he's talking about. So the individual may and is to take care of her widows, and then the church acting as a collective, acting as a unit, then is not to be involved in that situation. They're to turn their attention to others. There is a difference. In other words, there is a difference between the individual Christian and the church acting collectively, acting as a unit. For example, through its treasury, through its pooled resources. The Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 14 that the body, the church, the body is many members, not one. And so you have the church, the body, it is composed of many members, not one. One person doesn't constitute a church. And so there is a distinction between a church and an individual. Of course, this is one of those doctrinal ideas that often goes unnoticed just in the religious world in general. But what we want to do is observe carefully whether an individual Christian is being given a responsibility in a passage, or if a church is being addressed and given responsibility that it's to carry out collectively. And so we want to be careful to observe that as we read and study. Responsibility is given. Is this given to an individual Christian, or is this responsibility given to a church and with the idea that it's to be fulfilled collectively by the local congregation? Well, maybe a few illustrations will help us distinguish between the church and individual Christians. Individual Christians may marry, but churches don't marry. I mean, the church at Oak Mountain is not going to marry the church at Cahaba Heights. That would just be weird. If nothing else, that'd just be weird. But no, we understand that individual Christians may marry, but churches don't marry. And when an individual Christian marries another, that's not the church acting collectively marrying. Well, we can see the distinction between churches and individuals. Individual Christians may start a business, but nowhere in the New Testament do local churches go into business to raise money. Individual Christians may be involved in recreational and social functions, but in the New Testament, churches acting collectively, they weren't involved in those kinds of things. And so in the passage before us, the distinction is clear, isn't it? Individual Christian woman who has widows is to take care of them. Let not the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are widows indeed. And so that's an important distinction to remember, especially when it comes to this particular issue, the issue of relieving the needs of people. Is the passage addressing individual Christians, or is it addressing churches acting collectively, acting as a unit? The second point I'll make is that in the New Testament, churches provided financial support to relieve the needs of Christians, though individual Christians were taught to provide help for both Christians and non-Christians. And so when churches, for example, pool their resources together and use those resources to relieve the needs of people, that churches pool their resources and use those resources to relieve the needs of Christians, of other Christians. Now, individually, Christians were told to do good to everyone, Christian and non-Christian alike. But as we'll see in just a moment, when we look at the passages involved, we see really a consistent pattern. I don't know what other word to use. That pattern, the word pattern has kind of fallen into disuse today, and some don't like it, but when you look at it, I really don't know what other word to use. In Acts chapter 2, for example, and we won't read these passages in their entirety, but in Acts chapter 2, verse 43, everyone, well, if you go back a little bit, verse 41, those who received the word were baptized. They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' doctrine and fellowship. Everyone who received the word and was baptized, and everyone that was continuing in the apostles' teaching and fellowship, kept feeling a sense of awe, and many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles, and all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. All those who believed. And so this is taking place among the believers. All those who believed were together, had all things in common, began selling their property and possessions, and were sharing them with all as anyone might have need. And so that describes what was taking place among this new community of believers, these new Christians, the church here in Jerusalem. Well, in Acts chapter 4, we read about a similar situation. And the congregation of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and not one of them claimed that anything belonging to him was his own, but all things were common property to them. And so here again we have this activity taking place among the congregation of those who believe. Verse 34 says, there was not a needy person among them, for all who were owners of land or houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to each as any had need. Joseph did this, and Ananias and Sapphira, they got in on it, although they made serious error in their case. In Acts chapter 6, now at this time, while the number of disciples was increasing, a complaint arose on the part of the Hellenistic Jews. And so here we have something taking place among the number of disciples. In Acts chapter 11, Acts 11 beginning in verse 27. At this time some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, one of them named Agabus. He predicted that a famine would take place. In verse 29, and in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each one of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. They did this. They pulled their money together and sent it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. But the recipients were the brethren. And so I think we can see a pattern developing. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and I'll stop this in just a moment, but 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1, Paul says, concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collection be made when I come. There's a collection for the saints. You see the same thing in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. Romans chapter 15 and verse 25. And so we read about the church pooling its resources and using that money to take care of the needs of believers or disciples or saints, or 1 Timothy 5, widows indeed. Now, and so that's what we practice here at Oak Mountain. We pool our resources together, and as we learn of situations where Christians have need, well, then we may take money from that treasury, from that pool, and supply the needs of our brethren in Christ. Now, there were two other passages that became points of controversy back, I guess that's 50, 60 years ago now. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, and James chapter 1 and verse 27. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, it sure sounds like that might be talking about a collective, because he says, so then while we have opportunity, that's a plural, isn't it? While we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who are of the household of the faith. And so what we've said is that the church is to be involved in the work of relieving the needs of needy people, but the church's responsibility is toward other Christians and not toward those who are not Christians. Well, this passage appears to say, let us do good to all men. To all men. But if you look closely, you can see that the idea is that each of us as individuals is to do good to all men. And so look at verse 6. The one who is taught the word is to share all good things with the one who teaches him. He goes on to say, verse 7, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And so then let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due season we will reap. That is, of course, each of us reaps in the judgment as an individual. And then while we as individual Christians have opportunity, let's do good to all men. And so, if you look at it carefully, you'll see that this is addressed to individual Christians. And then James 1:26 says, if anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. So pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit the orphans and widows in their distress, keep oneself unstained from the world. Again, a passage that deals with the responsibility of individual Christians. Well, as I said a moment ago, we want to be careful, and when we look at these passages, to determine, is he talking to a church and talking about the church acting as a unit, perhaps through the funds that it's pooled together in a common treasury? Or is he talking about individual Christians? And we see a consistent pattern. When the church acted collectively, it relieved the needs of other Christians, whether Christians among their own number or Christians in faraway places. But when it comes to doing good to all people, Christian and non-Christian alike, well, then those passages are directed toward individual Christians. Well, let me make a couple more observations. That there are limits to the responsibility of the church in responding to requests for help. There's some limits. Well, we saw in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that Paul limited what the church was to do in that passage. And so if a woman who's a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened. The church is limited. In this situation, the church is limited in what it might do. So we know that there are some limitations as far as the responsibility of the church is concerned in these matters. I can tell you, the practice of the elders here has been that if someone requests some help from us, of course we listen to each case individually and we sort of judge it on its own merits. But the church should expect all who have the ability to work to work. All right? And so if a person has the ability to work and to support himself and to support his family, well then that's what he ought to do. Now, I understand that sometimes a person is looking for work. He's not working, but he's looking. Okay, I can understand that. And in those kinds of situations, oh yeah, we're all ears. We want to listen and we want to help. But if someone comes to us, we're going to ask them, are you working? Are you looking for work? And if the answer is, well, no, okay, well then you need to work. You need to work full-time. That might be one full-time job or two part-time jobs. But you need to do what you can do to support yourself and your family before the church becomes involved. That's 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. A man won't take care of his own. He's worse than an unbeliever. Our goal is to help people get to a position where they don't need help any longer. That's our goal. Now, it may be that sometimes we help somebody over a sustained period of time. But our goal is, if possible, to help people get to the point where they independently support themselves. That's what the Scriptures teach them to do. The church is not bound to enable a person to live on the level he decides is comfortable for himself. A person may need to downsize or eliminate unnecessary expenditures or learn to get by with less before appealing to the church for help. This is an exaggerated situation or illustration. Someone were to come and say, well, I saw this nice $500,000 house over here and I decided I wanted to... And instead of buying an old car, we bought brand new cars. We really like those Mercedes and Lexi. We're going to say, look, it's not the responsibility of the church to enable you to live on the level that you think is comfortable for yourself. You might need to downsize. All right? You might need to eliminate unnecessary expenses. You might learn to get by with less before appealing to the church. We sometimes have an inaccurate view of what in need means. We can live well with much less than sometimes we think we can. All right, so what am I doing? What am I doing to support myself before I turn to the church? Is it the church's responsibility to provide financial support to someone who has resources that could be used to support himself? And so let's say a person has a piece of property over here, and it's worth $100,000, let's just say, to pick a number, and he comes to the church, I need some help, we got this property, well, I don't want to use that. I'm saving that for, is that the church's responsibility to provide him financial support when he has resources at his disposal that could be used? Well, we need to do what we can to draw upon our own resources before we turn to the church. Is it the church's responsibility to provide support to someone because circumstances have become inconvenient or because other solutions to the problem might be inconvenient? And so a child might turn to the church to provide financial help for his parents, even though he has resources to help, but it would be inconvenient for him to use those resources. Are we to enable that? So we should use our own resources, whatever we have at our disposal, to fulfill our own responsibility first. Family first. And then, of course, the church should become involved when it becomes necessary. Well, I'll end all this simply by saying that relieving the needs of people is not the primary work of the church. Now, that sounds harsh, I'm sure, to contemporary ears, people who think that that's why the church exists, to sort of take care of the needs of all the people in the world. But that's not the primary work of the church. The primary work of the church is teach the gospel. Teach the gospel. Use your money to support the preaching of the gospel. I remember in Acts chapter 6 and verse 2 that the apostles told those who complained about their widows being neglected, it's not appropriate for us to forsake the Word of God to serve tables. Our job is preaching the Word. Now, we'll take care of that issue, but we're not going to stop what we're doing in preaching the Word and to take care of that. And I imagine that may have sounded harsh to some people, but that was just the case. And so the primary work of the church is spiritual in nature, teaching, evangelism, worshiping God, and things like that. As situations which involved needy Christians arose and came to the attention of churches, they responded. So there's Acts chapter 11. There's going to be a famine. Oh, okay. Glad you made us aware of that. We're going to respond. And so as situations arose, and as the church became aware of those situations, it responded. But the first job on their list was to teach the Word. Well, this is what we do here at Oak Mountain. The great majority of the money we collect, the vast majority of it, goes to support the preaching and teaching of the gospel, either locally or in other places. And if you count the building as a tool that we use to preach and teach the gospel, to the place to meet where that work is, well, almost all of the money that we collect would be spent on that. As we learn of Christians in need, whether here or elsewhere, we respond to that. And so someone may come to our attention. Here's a brother or a sister there. They're really struggling. Okay, we will respond to that. Or we might hear of a situation elsewhere. There are brethren over here. Sometimes a natural disaster may happen in a faraway place and Christians are affected by it. Okay, well, we'll respond to that. That's consistent with what we see in the New Testament. But our primary work is teaching the gospel, preaching the gospel. And that's what we want to be sure we're taking care of. Well, our time is more than up tonight. I appreciate your patience. But what I wanted to do in this lesson is take a look at what the New Testament says about the church and its role in relieving the needs of people. These were tremendously controversial issues in the 1950s and 60s and maybe on into the 70s. They're not as discussed as often today as they once were. And it may be that those coming up are not familiar with them. Well, we need to be familiar with them. We need to understand the principles that are involved in these kinds of issues. One reason is because these issues, these kinds of issues, the principles involved in these issues are going to come up again and again and again. With every generation will face some issue involving Bible authority. That's really what we're talking about. What do we have Bible authority to do as a church? All right, so every generation I imagine will deal with that in one form or another. And so what I've tried to do is just take advantage of this opportunity to address some of these issues. If you're here tonight and not a Christian, we don't close the service without giving you an opportunity to respond to the invitation to the gospel. If you're ready to respond, if you're a believer, you're ready to repent and be baptized, you can become a Christian tonight. If you're already a Christian but you're not right because of sin, well then make that right. Do what you need to do It may be simply privately ask God for forgiveness. It may be approaching a brother or a sister against whom we've sinned and talking to them about the situation. Or it may be that a public confession is necessary. And so whatever you need to do, we encourage you to do it. If we can help, we invite you to come as we stand and sing together.